To live in an age saturated with forecasts is to live in an age haunted by them. Every dashboard on our phones renders the days ahead in lines and colors. Growth curves, climate trajectories, volatility indexes, epidemiological models, political polls. We wake up to probabilities and go to bed to projections. This data-rich atmosphere, meant to guide us, often magnifies an older fear, that the future will arrive as a verdict rather than as a field of possibilities. Yet philosophy teaches that the future is not a meteorological front that happens to us, but a horizon our thinking helps to shape. It is not denial to say this. It is an older wisdom, sharpened in eras as uncertain as our own. When Socrates asked what kind of life was worth living, he was not escaping history. He was giving human dignity its compass under conditions no less unstable than ours. To see philosophy as an antidote to fear is not to pretend the storms are not real. It is to cultivate the inner strength, clarity, and practical judgment that allow us to move through them without surrendering either to despair or to distraction. Fear of the future thrives where thought is shallow and the will is scattered. Philosophy, at its best, deepens thought and gathers the will. If you find value here, please consider subscribing now so you do not miss the next reflections. It takes only a moment and helps this work reach more readers. The fear we speak of has many names: anxiety, dread, foreboding. In classical vocabulary, thumos ungoverned by logos. In modern psychology, anticipatory stress, intolerance of uncertainty. Its physiological currents are ancient. A surge of cortisol, attentional narrowing, a readiness to fight, flee, or freeze. The evolutionary toolkit that once kept our ancestors alert to rustling bushes has adapted to push notifications and breaking news. We are, in a sense, overfitted to catastrophe. Yet an important distinction must be preserved. Fear is a signal that something matters. Panic is the belief that nothing can be done. Philosophy intervenes between signal and belief, teaches us to ask, what is within my power? What judgments am I adding to the raw facts? What virtues are relevant here? Who am I trying to become? These are not abstractions but instruments. One can carry them into a boardroom, into a hospital waiting room, into a conversation with a child who asks, will everything be okay? The tools do not erase risk. They restore agency, proportion, and meaning. Consider first the Stoic insight that events are not up to us, but our responses to them are. This is often caricatured as resignation. It is rather a discipline of attention. When Epictetus divides reality into what is within our control, our judgments, intentions, and actions, and what is not, externals like reputation, health, and fortune, he does not tell us to be passive about the latter. He tells us to place our emotional investment where it can do the most good. This practice, called the dichotomy of control, can be tested empirically. Studies on cognitive appraisal and stress indicate that reframing a stressor in terms of controllable elements reduces physiological arousal and improves performance. The Stoics anticipated this by 2 millennia. They did not wait for the future to be kind. They chose to be prepared. The Stoic exercise of premeditatio malorum, imagining possible setbacks in advance, rehearses our responses without indulging our catastrophizing. It converts a picture of doom into a plan for conduct. If a project fails, I will bear it with dignity, learn soberly, and try again. If an illness comes, I will mobilize care, maintain reason, and honor my commitments. Fear loosens its grip when the will has a script grounded in principle. Yet Stoicism is only one thread. Existentialism, often thought of as bleak, offers a fierce antidote to future fear by insisting on our authorship. For Sartre, we are condemned to be free, which means we cannot outsource responsibility to circumstances or to the times. Even passivity is a choice that shapes what comes next. This is not a license for recklessness. It is a call to lucidity. Kierkegaard, writing about anxiety, calls it the dizziness of freedom, the vertigo we feel at the cliff edge where many paths open. He does not tell us to back away from the cliff. He tells us to learn to stand there without fainting, to cultivate faith, not as a denial of risk, but as trust that the leap of commitment can be made without foreknowledge of all outcomes. This spiritual courage, translated into secular terms, is the courage to choose projects that honor our values even when success is uncertain. Fear is strongest when we imagine the future as a single, fixed outcome looming over us. Existential thinking reminds us that the future is braided from our choices, that its shape is not pre-inscribed but emerges with our actions. In every uncertain quarter, a small act of fidelity, to truth, to care, to beauty, pushes possibility in a humane direction. A third tradition, Aristotelian in spirit, speaks of phronesis, practical wisdom. It is an intellectual virtue that calibrates our actions to the messy particulars of life. Rules alone cannot tell us what to do. Neither can pure impulse. We need cultivated judgment, which grows through habit and reflection. The fearful person tends to overgeneralize from worst-case scenarios. Phronesis instead reads the situation. It asks, who are the stakeholders? What goods are at play? What risks are tolerable? What time horizon is relevant? Those with practical wisdom accept that not all goods can be maximized simultaneously. They make trade-offs with integrity, and they do not postpone every good until all uncertainty is eliminated. The research literature on decision-making under uncertainty corroborates Aristotle. Experience with feedback improves calibration, and calibration reduces both overconfidence and paralysis. The wise person uses decision pre-mortems and post-mortems. They listen to dissenting views. They distribute power and cultivate resilience. To think in this way is already to fear less, because the chaos of everything could happen resolves into the order of here is how we will proceed. A fourth perspective arrives from ancient and Eastern philosophies that relativize the self without negating action. Buddhism diagnoses suffering as attachment, clinging to what changes and aversion to what will come. The future is the most tempting object of such clinging. Mindfulness is not a retreat from responsibility. It is the training of attention to the present reality of breathing, sensing, and thinking, so that the phantoms of the future do not tyrannize the mind. Modern clinical studies show mindfulness-based interventions reduce rumination and anxiety, improving both subjective well-being and executive function. This is not surprising. A mind able to notice its own fear without fusing with it has more room to respond wisely. The Bhagavad Gita counsels action without attachment to the fruits. Do the work that is yours to do, with excellence and devotion, and let the results be what they will. This stance does not make one indifferent to outcomes. It makes one steadfast when outcomes fluctuate. As climates warm and markets lurch, steadiness has ethical value. People who are centered can be relied upon. They do not add to the world's panic. The fear of the future often feeds on time's distortions. We overestimate short-term catastrophe and underestimate long-term transformation. Consider the historical record. In the 19th century, Malthus predicted that population growth would outstrip resources, producing unavoidable calamity. He was not foolish. His model fit what he could see. He did not foresee the agricultural innovations of the 20th century or the demographic transitions that would slow growth across many regions. In the 20th century, nuclear annihilation seemed not just possible but inevitable. Yet deterrence, diplomacy, and a new international architecture, however fragile, preserved a tense peace. This does not mean the future is safe. It means the future is not linear. It is shaped by human ingenuity, by moral imagination, and by the slow pressure of norms. Philosophical reflection keeps this horizon open. It reminds us that normative change, what people believe is right or wrong, can redirect technical capability. When abolitionists argued that slavery was a moral abomination, they were not calculating expected utilities. They were expanding the sphere of the human. In our time, arguments about dignity, justice, and stewardship can likewise tilt the arc. Still, optimism is not the antidote to fear. Courage is. Optimism declares that things will likely turn out well. Courage decides to act rightly even if they might not. Philosophy supplies reasons to choose courage. It discloses goods that surpass the calculus of fear. Truth, friendship, justice, beauty, reverence for life. When these goods become central, many anxieties shrink to fit their proper scale. You do not cease to care about your portfolio. You cease to let it define your peace. You do not deny the reality of contagion. You refuse to let anxiety isolate you from compassion. Courage is contagious. Teams led by people who frame uncertainty in terms of shared purpose rather than looming threat demonstrate higher cohesion and better problem-solving. Communities that cultivate rituals of meaning weather disasters with lower rates of mental health collapse. These are empirical observations, but they rest on philosophical commitments. That people are more than consumers, that meaning is more than hedonic comfort, that the good life is a life oriented by virtues and sustained by love. Let us translate these convictions into practices, because fear is not cured by slogans. Begin with the discipline of articulation. Give your fear words. I am afraid that the climate will destabilize and my children will inherit a world of scarcity. I am afraid that automation will make my work obsolete. I am afraid that illness will undo the plans I have made. Naming the fear is not indulging it. It is placing it within the space of thought, where it can be examined. Ask the Stoic questions. Which parts of this scenario are within my influence? What preparations could I make now? Then ask the existential question. Which values do I choose to honor regardless of what happens? Then the Aristotelian, what is a prudent next step this week, given my resources? Then the Buddhist, how can I act without clinging to results, returning to the breath when rumination surges? If you do this consistently, fear becomes the beginning of philosophy rather than the end of hope. Second, cultivate moral exemplars. Our fear imagines a lonely future. Examples remind us that we are heirs to courage. Think of Viktor Frankl, who, in conditions far beyond ordinary fear, discovered that meaning is not a luxury but a survival skill. Think of Wangari Maathai, who turned ecological despair into a movement of tree planting and women's empowerment. Think of the scientists who shared genomic data in the crucial early weeks of an outbreak not for profit but for humanity. Think of caregivers who, in pandemics, show up with masks and kindness and bear the weight of grief with gentleness. By placing these images before the mind, you educate your imagination. You are less likely to believe that the only future possible is one in which everyone acts selfishly. Fear shrinks when we are reminded of the capacity of persons to be good. The philosopher Iris Murdoch called attention a just and loving gaze directed upon an individual reality. Direct that gaze toward the future. Look for small reliabilities, for habits of decency, for institutions that work quietly. They are there and they can be strengthened. Third, adopt a posture toward information that protects your attention. Fear is amplified by information diets that reward immediacy over understanding. Philosophy counsels slowness. Read fewer headlines and more essays. Consult sources that present opposing views in good faith. Learn to distinguish forecast from judgment and correlation from cause. When you encounter models, ask what their assumptions are and what uncertainties they conceal. Accept that some unknowns are irreducible. Embrace interval estimates. A measured relationship to information does not make one naive. It makes one free. The aim is not to be less informed, but to be more thoughtfully informed. This allows genuine risk to be taken seriously without ceding the mind to speculative frenzy. It is a moral discipline because attention is a moral resource. What we attend to we authorize to shape us. Fourth, practice shared deliberation. Fear isolates, but wisdom is social. Create circles, families, teams, communities, where the question, what should we do next, is asked openly, and where disagreement is permitted without contempt. Philosophers have always practiced in conversation. Socrates walked the marketplace asking inconvenient questions. Confucius taught ethics through dialogue and example. Modern organizations that institute premortems, scenario planning, and red teams are, in effect, institutionalizing philosophical humility. They acknowledge that the future contains surprises, so they broaden their sightlines and distribute the cognitive load. This is good governance at any scale. It converts dread into preparation, and preparation into solidarity. Fifth, attend to the small-scope future. We often mean by the future the next 50 years of geopolitics or climate evolution. But there are nearer futures that need our care. The next 3 hours, the next week, the next season. Philosophy invites us to live well at these scales. Marcus Aurelius, emperor and philosopher, wrote in his journal, "Do now what nature requires." By nature, he meant the nature of a rational social being. Call a friend. Do the task before you with excellence. Step outside and notice the sky. Prepare a meal and share it. These are not evasions. They are practices of sanity. A life made of such acts becomes resilient against the shockwaves of larger uncertainties. It is anchored in goods that cannot be taken completely away. When the big future frightens you, build the next good hour. Do it repeatedly. You will be surprised how the horizon begins to widen. One might object, is this not merely personal coping in the face of systemic threats? Does philosophy not risk becoming a private refuge for the privileged while the world burns? It is a fair challenge. The answer is that philosophy, rightly practiced, enlarges responsibility rather than shrinking it. By reducing paralyzing fear, it frees energy for action. By clarifying values, it directs action where it matters most. By cultivating humility, it opens cooperation across differences. A less fearful citizen is a more capable one. A less fearful leader is better able to bear short-term costs for long-term goods. A less fearful community can undertake collective projects without tearing itself apart at the first sign of stress. The antidote is not meant to numb us but to steady us for work. It asks us to confront injustice with clear eyes and to organize with patience. It asks us to see that the future is not a single catastrophe arriving everywhere, but many local battles that can be won. There is also beauty which philosophy does not ignore. Fear narrows perception to threats. Beauty reopens our senses to what deserves awe. The night sky, a piece of music, a well-made object, the sincerity in another's face. These experiences shift the mind's scale. They do not solve problems, but they remind us of what we are defending. They also refresh the will. People who regularly experience aesthetic wonder report higher resilience and a greater willingness to help others. This is not accidental. Beauty is a rehearsal for hope. It shows that the world can exceed our expectations in the direction of grace. Let yourself be surprised in this way, and the future acquires a different hue. It is no longer only a list of risk factors, but a landscape where gifts may appear. Finally, remember mortality. This seems like the cruelest counsel in a time of fear, but it is the oldest and the most liberating. Memento mori is not an invitation to gloom. It is a reminder that our time is finite and therefore precious. If we avoid thinking about death, the future becomes an endless postponement. We say yes to nothing because there is always more time to say yes later. When we accept finitude, choices acquire weight, and gratitude multiplies. The philosopher who has rehearsed death, Montaigne says, has unlearned how to be a slave. He meant a slave to fear. If the worst thing that can happen, the end of our life, is something we have contemplated and fit into a meaningful view of existence, then lesser losses, though painful, no longer rule us. We can risk, we can love, we can commit. In the end, fear of the future is the shadow cast by our capacity to imagine. That same capacity is also the source of our antidote. Philosophy trains imagination to work for us rather than against us. It draws pictures of the good and of the noble, of the prudent and of the steadfast, and then it asks us to practice becoming like those pictures. It recruits our reason, our emotions, and our habits. It connects us to traditions of wisdom that survived wars and plagues and upheavals. It makes our own brief span part of a story that honors the triumphs and the failures of those who came before. Equip yourself with these resources, and the future will still be uncertain, but it will no longer be an enemy. It will be what it has always been for human beings. An invitation. If a person is to live without bondage to fear, they must learn to tell truer stories about time. We inherit narratives from family, culture, and media that often cast the future as a test we are destined to fail. The script goes like this: we are fragile, the world is hostile, and the next blow will be the one we cannot survive. Such narratives have a grain of truth. Fragility is real, hostility exists, but they are incomplete and therefore distorting. They omit our capacity for adaptation, for solidarity, for innovation, for sacrifice, capacities repeatedly evidenced in crises large and small. Philosophy is the craft of story correction. It replaces fatalism with agency, hysteria with proportion, and cynicism with responsibility. The point is not to recite a fairy tale in which everything will be fine. The point is to orient our attention so that we perceive as fully as possible what is endangered and what can be preserved, what is broken and what can be repaired, what must be relinquished and what must be defended. Start with the present because all futures are grown from it. The best spur to meaningful action is not abstract possibility but concrete reality. If climate change frightens you, learn the carbon profile of your own life and your institutions. Understand where leverage lies: energy sources, buildings, transportation, food systems. Join efforts that scale solutions. Retrofitting, policy advocacy, technology deployment, cultural shifts that make sustainable practices normative. When fear is transmuted into contribution, a feedback loop begins. You meet other contributors, your skills deepen, your hope becomes informed, and your fear becomes manageable. If artificial intelligence worries you, study its actual capabilities and limitations. Learn what alignment means, what interpretability seeks, what governance mechanisms are being proposed. Participate in shaping norms and regulations. Refuse the extremes of techno-euphoria and techno-doom. If economic precarity looms, invest in human capital that will remain valuable under multiple scenarios. Critical thinking, collaboration, ethical judgment, adaptability. These are not vacuous platitudes. They are applications of philosophical virtues to specific domains. They move the locus of control from the indefinite out there to the definite here. But the personal is not sufficient. Institutions are the vessels in which collective futures are carried, and philosophy must inform how we build and reform them. Democratic institutions, for example, depend on a citizenry capable of reasoned disagreement. Fear erodes this capacity because it incentivizes purity and punishes nuance. Philosophy, by modeling charity in interpretation and rigor in argument, helps rebuild the common space where compromise is not treachery but prudence. Educational institutions should teach not only skills for employment but habits of thought for citizenship. How to distinguish an argument from an assertion, how to weigh evidence, how to revise beliefs without shame. Professional institutions, from hospitals to newsrooms to technology firms, need ethical frameworks that are not mere checklists but living commitments. Explicit statements of purpose, open channels for raising concerns, and leadership that welcomes correction. Where such frameworks exist, fear-based decision-making, short-termism, secrecy, scapegoating finds less purchase. Hope also requires attention to measurement. What we measure shapes what we strive for, and thus the futures we enable. Gross domestic product is a crude proxy for well-being. If we seek a future less haunted by fear, we need indicators that capture health, education, environmental quality, social trust, and mental well-being. Some countries and cities have begun to adopt such dashboards. Organizations can do likewise. The presence of a broader scorecard changes choices. Investments in green space, in cultural life, in preventive healthcare, in early childhood education, and in civic infrastructure start to look like security policies rather than luxuries. Empirical research shows that social trust correlates with resilience in crises. Trust grows where institutions are competent and fair, where corruption is punished, and where inequality is addressed not just economically but symbolically, by treating all citizens with dignity. Philosophy cannot write a budget, but it can shape the imagination of what counts. Another antidote to fear lies in relearning patience. Our age is calibrated to the tempo of virality. Patience is not procrastination. It is a form of courage that refuses to wrench buds into bloom. Consider the progress that matters most: character formation, institution building, scientific discovery, ecological restoration. These unfold over seasons, years, decades. Impatience, fueled by fear, leads to brittle strategies. Overpromising, underdelivering, burning out, breaking trust. Patience chooses the slow route that lasts. The historians I can help here. What seems like stagnation at the level of headlines may conceal slow revolutions. Literacy rates rising, disease burdens declining, rights expanding, clean technologies compounding. None of these trajectories is inevitable or universal. Reversals occur. But the lesson is that much good takes time and requires guardianship. If we only look for salvation in suddenness, fear will keep winning. Gratitude is allied to patience. It is not a sentimental feeling but a disciplined practice of noticing and naming the goods already present. To keep a gratitude ledger is to resist fear's monopoly over attention. Enumerate the people who have helped you, the tools you have access to, the freedoms you enjoy, the knowledges accumulated by generations before you. Such a ledger does not close its eyes to suffering. It anchors the will in abundance rather than in scarcity. The psychological literature is robust. Gratitude practices improve mental health and prosocial behavior. On the societal level, cultures that cultivate gratitude for common goods, public parks, libraries, water systems, public health, are more likely to invest in maintaining them. Fear says, everything is slipping away. Gratitude answers, much remains and we will tend it. We should also confront the metaphysical dimension of future fear, the question of meaning. If the universe is indifferent, why should we care about projects that may be undone by chaos? This question, pressed hard enough, can dissolve motive. Philosophy offers multiple responses. The religious traditions affirm that reality is grounded in a personal or transcendent good, God, the Tao, Brahman, the Absolute. In this view, our actions participate in a larger drama whose final sense exceeds our foresight. The secular existentialist affirms that meaning is created through commitment. Values are not discovered but made, and their binding force comes from the seriousness with which we own them. The humanist points to the intersubjective realm. Meaning arises from relationships, from shared endeavors, from contributions to a story larger than the self. These responses differ, but they converge on a practical counsel. Live as if your choices matter beyond calculation. The as if is not hypocrisy. It is a wager that makes human flourishing possible. When we live this way, fear becomes a counselor rather than a tyrant, alerting us to risks, not dictating our responses. A sober account of risk is also part of the antidote. Philosophy's love of clarity demands that we distinguish catastrophic risks, where stakes are existential and probabilities may be low but non-negligible, from chronic risks, where harms are diffuse but compounding, and from ordinary uncertainties, which are the fabric of life. We should match our energies to the category. Catastrophic risks require precaution, redundancy, and international coordination. Nuclear security, biosecurity, AI alignment, planetary boundaries. Chronic risks require persistence, equity, and cultural change. Public health, education, governance, media ecosystems. Ordinary uncertainties require resilience at the personal and organizational level. Fear becomes destructive when it treats all risk as catastrophic or all uncertainty as imminent doom. Philosophical literacy in risk helps us act proportionately. It recommends investment in preparedness not as paranoia but as prudence, and it defends joy not as escapism but as fuel for endurance. Some will say that philosophy is distant from action, that it floats above the world in abstractions while others do the work. But the lineage of action-minded philosophy is long. The ancient Stoics advised emperors, Confucian thinkers shaped dynasties, abolitionists sharpened moral arguments that drove political change. Simone while labored in factories to understand workers' lives. Hannah Arendt thought in public about totalitarianism and the conditions for political renewal. Martha Nussbaum has argued for capabilities approaches that affect development policy. Philosophy earns its keep when it returns from the heights with tools that can be used at ground level. In your own sphere, home, classroom, clinic, workshop, philosophy asks, what is the purpose here? What virtues does this role demand? What obligations do we owe those affected by our decisions? How do we distribute burdens and benefits fairly? The more consistently such questions are asked, the less room fear has to stampede us into self-protection at the expense of the good. It helps to practice grief. Fear often masks anticipated grief, the losses we expect but cannot yet name. Unpracticed grief becomes anger or numbness. Practiced grief becomes tenderness and resolve. Rituals of mourning, personal and communal, integrate loss into life rather than banishing it to the margins where it festers. Philosophy has always engaged grief, not to domesticate it but to understand its place in a meaningful life. The Stoics did not deny tears. They denied despair. The Buddhists do not deny impermanence. They teach us to regard it without aversion. The Abrahamic traditions do not deny lament. They turn it into prayer and solidarity. Our future will contain losses. If we have learned to grieve, we are less likely to let fear preoccupy our imagination with anticipated pain. We will make room for sorrow when it arrives, and until then we will live. The soil of courage is community. Fear diminishes when we are held by trustworthy relationships. Invest in the kind of friendship Aristotle praised. Not alliances of convenience or instruments of utility, but bonds of character in which each seeks the other's good. Such friendships are laboratories of the future. In them we practice candor without cruelty, loyalty without blindness, and joy without envy. Multiply these bonds into associations and institutions, choirs, cooperatives, clinics, startups, schools, neighborhoods, and we have the infrastructure of hope. Social science confirms what common sense knows. People embedded in strong networks are healthier, happier, and more resilient. When disaster comes, mutual aid often precedes formal assistance. Philosophy does not build community alone, but it gives community its rationale and its rituals. It sacralizes the ordinary time we spend together, reminding us that to share a table is to share a future. One of the most practical philosophical habits is to write letters to the future. This can be literal notes to one's children, students, or one's later self, or institutional mission statements, constitutions, ethics codes meant to outlast us. The act of writing such letters disciplines the mind. It asks, what do we want those who come after to inherit from us? What warnings are worth sending? What blessings can we offer? What standards can we articulate so that when fear is high, there is something to lean on? The U.S. Constitution, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Hippocratic Oath, the precautionary principle, these are all letters to the future. They do not solve every problem, but they set a tone and a boundary. In your own life, write smaller letters. A family ethos, a team charter, a personal code. Revisit them as conditions change. They will not eliminate fear, but they will guide you when fear clamors for rashness. To befriend uncertainty, cultivate curiosity. Fear asks, what if? With dread. Curiosity asks, what if? With wonder. Children are naturally curious. Fear enters as they learn what can hurt. Maturity lies not in extinguishing curiosity but in intertwining it with caution. The curious adult asks, what can we learn from this anomaly? What hypothesis could we test? What conversation has not yet been attempted? The spirit of inquiry is the engine of progress. It is also a bomb. Neurological studies suggest that curiosity activates reward pathways and reduces anxiety-driven avoidance. In practical terms, a curious leader stabilizes a team. Instead of punishing bad news, they investigate. Instead of guessing motives, they ask. Instead of denying uncertainty, they map it. In this climate, fear has fewer places to hide. The future also requires reverence. This is an unfashionable word, but philosophy has always had room for it. Reverence is the recognition of a value greater than utility. It is the stance Michelangelo took toward stone, and farmers take toward soil, and good teachers take toward minds, and physicians take toward life. When reverence informs our relations to nature, to artifacts, to institutions, to each other, we treat the future as a trust rather than a market. We build for durability, not just for speed. We maintain as well as invent. We protect as well as exploit. The environmental philosopher Holmes Ralston speaks of duties to natural kinds, species and ecosystems that extend beyond our immediate use. Indigenous philosophies teach stewardship as a sacred duty. Reverence is not nostalgia. It is a discipline that constrains our appetites and educates our desires so that the futures we create are ones we can honor. Much of fear comes from comparison. We measure our prospects against idealized images and find our lives wanting. The philosopher's countermeasure is to distinguish the real from the imaginary and the necessary from the superfluous. Stoic teachings about preferred indifference, wealth, status, even health, do not deny their value but deny their ultimacy. To internalize this is to loosen fear's grip on your identity. It is easier to take ethical risks, to accept setbacks, to pivot when plans change. The point is not to withdraw from ambitions, but to anchor life in goods that cannot be stolen by volatility. Integrity, generosity, fidelity, insight. With such an anchor, venturing into the unknown becomes bearable and even bracing. Let us return to time where we began. The future is often imagined as a single river flowing toward us. It may be better imagined as a delta, many channels diverging and rejoining, some drying up, others deepening. We influence which channels carry the most water. At the personal scale, the channels are habits. At the social scale, the channels are norms, laws, and technologies. At the civilizational scale, the channels are the stories we tell about what it means to be human. Philosophy concerns itself with all three. It knows that habits are easier to form than to break, so it counsels early and steady practice. It knows that norms crystallize when communities make them visible and praiseworthy, so it encourages rituals and institutions. It knows that grand stories must be compelling as well as true, so it summons poets and prophets as allies. If we take this multiscalar view, our fear becomes less amorphous. We see where to lay stone, where to dredge silt, where to let a stream run free. At the end of many philosophical texts, there is a turn from argument to exhortation. Consider this such a turn. The invitation is simple. Live as if the future needed your wisdom, your courage, your tenderness. Live as if your example would be someone's antidote to fear. Live as if the virtues you practice at your desk, at your table, on your street, ripple outward beyond your sight. None of this requires fame or power. It requires attention, practice, and willingness to be guided by the best that humans have thought and done. Read widely, think carefully, converse generously, decide bravely, act kindly, rest gratefully. When fear returns, as it will, welcome it as a messenger, hear it out, then ask it to take a seat while you and your companions do the work at hand. You are not alone in this. Across centuries, in monasteries and marketplaces, in parliaments and prisons, people have asked how to live under uncertain skies. They have left us sentences to carry. He who has a why can bear almost any how. What we can control are our opinions, impulses, desires, and aversions, nothing else. Love and do what you will. Act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In the depth of winter, I finally learned that within me there lay an invincible summer. These are not slogans for a poster. They are seeds. Plant them in the soil of your day. Water them with small acts. Protect them with community. Watch what grows. And when you look outward, toward all that has not yet happened, try this. Choose one sphere to care for, one skill to hone, one relationship to deepen, one injustice to resist, one beauty to create, one tradition to carry forward, one risk to take for the sake of love. These are anchors in time. They will not make the future safe, but they will make you ready. Read again the scroll of worry that runs in your mind, and beside each line write a counterline of resolve. Train your eyes to notice evidence of goodness. Let your words dignify others. Let your work be careful. Let your rest be honest. Let your plans be flexible. Let your principles be firm. When the storm arrives, you will have something to hold. The antidote to fear is not certainty. It is wisdom. Certainty is brittle. Wisdom is supple. Certainty shatters when the world surprises it. Wisdom bends, learns, recalibrates, persists. The future will surprise us. Let us be supple enough to meet it. Let us be students of the best traditions and teachers of the next generation. Let us enlarge the space of reason, protect the vulnerable, and nurture the beautiful. Let us, in our various spheres, small and great, bring forth the kind of steadiness that allows hope to be more than a feeling. Then the future, whatever it brings, will find in us not frightened spectators but responsible participants, not passive recipients of fate but artisans of possibility. In this way, philosophy becomes not a room one visits, but the architecture of a life, open to the light, strong against the winds, hospitable to strangers and oriented, always, toward horizons worth walking toward.